I am very pleased to introduce the workshop today on the spatial economic effects of conflict. And let me start by thanking our co-sponsors of the workshop, the George Washington University's Institute for International Economic Policy, in particular, Professor Remy Jedwab, co-organizer of the conference, and my good friends in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank Group. It's great to see everybody today. I'm Debbie Wetzel. I'm the Director of Regional Integration for Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and North Africa at the World Bank. That means I'm responsible for all of our regional work across the African continent. Our total commitment in terms of dollars to this work is about 14 billion, and our work covers those issues that cut across borders. So they're not contained within national boundaries, but are issues that are really driven by things that cannot be contained. As you will know from your work, there's a direct link between efforts to support regional integration and territoriality in conflicts. Under our current cycle for international development assistance, and over the past decade or so, we've been very focused on how the World Bank's engagement on mitigating and preventing violence, conflicts, and fragility in Africa is a fundamental and top priority. As many of you will know, we've worked with the UN to develop a joint framework called Pathways for Peace, so that we have a shared analytical background on the form that the humanitarian development peace nexus might take. And then we use that to look as well through how we can systematically understand the structural drivers of conflict and violence. We've taken that and absorbed it into our own strategic framework and strategy on fragility, conflict, and violence that was put out in 2020. As a result of all that, in our work on regional integration, we have done a recent strategy update. We've really stepped up our engagement on understanding and addressing the drivers of conflict in 4 areas in particular: the Sahel, the Lake Chad region, the Horn of Africa, and the Great Lakes. So while we work across the continent, these 4 specific areas are areas of a particular concentration for our work in identifying and understanding cross-cutting issues. The issues in the papers that you're going to discuss today are directly relevant and directly echo our efforts to try to understand and address the drivers of conflict that go beyond national borders, that are regional in nature. We've all been experiencing the effects of COVID, a pandemic that cuts across borders, but we also know that conflicts cut across borders. And so we have lots of work in the 3 frontier area in Sahel, working across borders in the Horn of Africa, et cetera. We also have examples of local crises that degenerate into regional ones that are extending into very large spaces. And all we need to do is read the news to hear about those, whether it's Tigray or Niger or Burkina, these local conflicts that are spreading more broadly. From Sahel, where we've got the northern Malian insurrection that's morphed into a regional intense conflict, to Lake Chad, where we have a clash. The clash in the state of Borno has become a full-fledged regional conflict. These protracted conflicts are impeding chances for these landlocked, lagging, and often really remote regions to catch up with the more dynamic areas of both their countries and the continent. So what we're going to discuss today couldn't be more relevant for the practical implications of how we help advance the situation on the African continent. Just to say a word about how we approach the issue as a group and how today's discussion can help us. We at the bank have been putting in place a few studies. Some of you will have contributed to those studies that are called regional risk and resilience assessments. We have completed one for the Sahel. We're about to complete one for Horn of Africa and Lake Chad. These are internal analytical diagnostic tools to help us better understand the nature of conflicts, from the political economy of a given region, to the competition over resources and governance mechanisms, to the regional factors of resilience, such as cross-border cooperation, migration, and coping capacities. These are great studies, but as of yet, we haven't been able to dig in as much as we would like into the feedback loop between regional conflicts and the poverty trap. And of course, in these areas, data is always something that's difficult to come by. And so we're working hard. Our teams are working with you and others to try to identify the data, be innovative in using data, and to see how we can provide more analytic underpinnings to the work that we're doing. We are really interested in benefiting from the cutting edge of academic research that many of you are working on how conflicts further exacerbate the pre-existing factors of underdevelopment. In our work in the 2009 World Development Report on reshaping economic geography, we identified some factors such as density, distance, and divisions, whether those are thick or thin. And we're particularly glad that one of our upcoming analytical pieces, the Lake Chad Regional Economic Memorandum, is going to use that framework, and some work in Horn of Africa has done so as well. So all of this contributes to help us further our understanding. And I guess it's from our perspective, it's super relevant because we need to understand, we need to take the deeper analytical work and improved understanding and use that to find ways to help mitigate these conflicts and see if we can find policy tools or other such tools to help address the situation and try to turn things around, how to mitigate the conflict that is leading to such severe impacts on the continent. So we really are grateful to everyone taking the time this morning to share their research and the work that we're doing. We look very much forward to the conversation and hearing the different reflections. And with that, I'm going to pass to my friend Carolina Sánchez-Páramo, who will moderate the roundtable with the presentations of our two keynote speakers, Chris Blattman and Dominic Rohner. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to a really rich discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, so much for setting us up so beautifully for the rest of the morning. And thank you to the organizers. It's really exciting to be doing this jointly with Debbie and her team, with George Washington University, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. As Debbie said, we're going to kick off the session this morning with what I think will be a very interesting panel conversation. We have two top speakers with remarkable experience in the topics that we are focusing on today. Chris Blattman, who's a professor of global conflict studies at the University of Chicago, and Dominic Rohner, who's the co-director of the Department of Economics at HEC at the University of Lausanne. So let me tell you a little bit about how things will work so that we all know what the plan is. We'll first give the floor to our two keynote speakers, and we'll give them about 20 minutes each to go through their presentations. And then we'll open it up for Q&A from all of you, the event participants. We're going to use the chat box to organize the Q&A. Please use everyone when you submit your questions and comments. I'll be monitoring that quite actively, both during the presentations and of course when we open up for discussion. And I'll be directing your questions and comments to the speakers. We'll have till about 10:30 for this first session, and then we'll have a second session that Jamie Jetwatt from George Washington University will chair, and he'll give more information about that when the time gets there. So let me then pass the floor to Chris Blattman for the first intervention. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. You can see that? You can hear me fine? Terrific. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a book that I am very close to finished writing. It's due in 2 weeks. So if you see anything screamingly erroneous, there is still time. And this is a book where it's really my attempt to take decades and decades of economics and political science and sociology and psychology and anthropology and try to boil it down. It's something I originally did from my own understanding and my own teaching, and I decided to write this as a book because all of these ideas, a lot of the people on this panel, their ideas are in here. among many others, I just didn't see them synthesized out there. I didn't see them talked about in the policy sphere or in the general public. And so that's really what this book is designed to do. And I want to start it in the city of Medellin. So you should have seen my slide advance. Did the slide advance? There's now a picture of a city. Thumbs up. Don't see thumbs up. Great, perfect. All right, terrific. So this is Medellin. It's Colombia's second largest city. It's the industrial and commercial heartland. It's prosperous. But what you're sort of looking at the metropolis, and then on either side, up these steep mountain slopes, sweep increasingly poor neighborhoods. Now, all of these are formal neighborhoods. They all have the presence of the state. They have property rights and water and electricity and even the occasional police officer. But nonetheless, if you live in one of these neighborhoods and you have a problem, if you need to, you have a tenant to evict, or you have a dispute with your neighbor, or someone's shoplifting from your store, or someone is bothering your daughter on the street, you might go to the police and you might go to the city government, but you might also go to something called the combo. Now, what's a combo? A combo is a street gang, like any other set of young men. They make a lot of their money from selling retail drugs on corners, but for all of these other kinds of governance services, they're charging people prices. They're knocking on the door of each shop for $2 or $3 a week, sometimes collecting the same things they call a vacuna or a vaccine from households as well. They're also probably responsible for a lot of the arepas and yogurt and eggs and other things that are sold from a lot of the corner stores. And what this means is, like, each of these neighborhoods is an incredibly valuable territory. And as a result, here you see sort of a map of Medellin in color. I'm showing you all of the low and middle and even high middle income neighborhoods. And the dots are essentially a census of these street gangs from some ongoing research that I'm doing. So there are about 350 to 400 street gangs in the city. And every square inch of every low and middle income neighborhood is controlled by one of them, because it's an incredibly valuable territory to hold. And so you would think that this is a recipe for violence. And indeed, that was our expectation. And it sort of made a lot of sense. One of the reasons we're aware of this and we've been understanding this is around 5 years ago, we started getting to know and interviewing senior gang leaders and middle-ranking gang leaders and some low-ranking gang leaders, many of whom are currently in prison, and they run this criminal empire, and they control these little principalities of theirs from prisons like Bella Vista. And it was in this prison that one of them told us about something I like to call the billiards war. And it began over a game of pool. Two sort of rival gangs were in the same cell block. And no one remembers why the argument broke out over the two rival members playing pool. What they do remember is that it got out of hand incredibly fast. And after they started brawling, one side pulled out their guns and fired on the other side. Now, why they have weapons in prison and why they're running their criminal empires from prison is a whole other talk. What's important to know is by the time the dust settled, 23 people were injured. Miraculously, no inmates or guards were killed. And what happened after that was a cycle of violence, as there were retaliatory killings within prison, but also all of the gangs, not just the gang members, the members of the same gang on the street, began to sort of engage in retaliatory killings, but they activated their alliances, and every gang in the city lined up behind one side or the other, and they prepared for war. And over the coming weeks, Medellin just ended up becoming one of the most violent places on the planet. Now, everything I've just told you is true, except for that last sentence. So that there was a billiards brawl, they did shoot each other, there were some retaliatory killings, the gangs did activate all their alliances on the street, every gang in the city did mobilize for a massive war, but then actually the billiards war never happened. The events I'm talking about are from about 2012 to 13, and what you can actually see is this is a period of relatively low violence. In fact, Medellin, even though at times it's been one of the most violent places on the planet, such as in the early 90s when Pablo Escobar went to war against the Colombian state, it's steadily been becoming less and less violent over time, to the point where the homicide rate per 100,000 people, which is what I'm graphing here, is lower than most large American cities. And in some sense, this illustrates, something it's many of us are aware of, others, it's easy to forget. And it's the fact that war is the exception, not the rule. Even when there are like incredible stakes to be had by seizing a rival's territory or competing with them over particular values or set of values or policy space, war is still the exception, not the rule. So most international wars get resolved quickly when they do happen. Most countries, though, have standoffs and Cold Wars, and they never actually launch into conflict against one of them. Most political blocs compete peacefully. For every 1,000 or 2,000 ethnic groups that are proximate to one another in whether it's Eastern Europe or Africa and have the potential to be in conflict, maybe only one or two in a given year actually engages in conflict. Likewise, many people have images of Nigerian cities or Indian cities full of interreligious and sectarian violence. But in fact, the number of religious factions who actually riot and compete violently are actually very, very small. It's actually a very small number of cities and a very almost tiny number of deaths relative to many other forms of violence. And likewise, many gangs find ways to carve out cities without full-scale war. And one of the things we do is we pay attention to the wars that happen, and we let these billiards wars that never happen and these conflicts that never happen slip from memory. A little bit like when the US military saw this famous story, the US military seeing bombers come back from World War II and looking at where the bullet holes were and deciding to armor those parts of the plane. And the statistician, Abraham Wald, whom some of you know for the Wald statistic, but who actually said, no, he deduced that the missing bullet holes were on the missing planes. The reason we don't have bullet holes on the cockpit and the engine, and we only see them on the wings and fuselage, is because the planes that were shot on the cockpit and the fuselage went down, and the ones that only took bullets to the wings and the body were survived. And when we only look at, and so that was a problem of selecting on the successes or survivorship bias. And with conflict, it's a little bit of the opposite problem. What we do is we focus on the failures, and we simply see these planes riddled with bullets, and we don't really know which ones were critical and which ones are not. And it distracts us, I think, from really focusing on what these crucial and structural causes of conflict are. And so not only do we overestimate the risk of war, which is one error when we focus on the wars that happen and not the ones that didn't, we get the causes wrong, and then by extension, we get the solutions wrong. And so there's this trace back any conflict, and you will find like a familiar set of bullet holes. And maybe they're the body, maybe they're on the engine, maybe they're on the conflict, the cockpit, from flawed leaders to unemployed youths, historic injustices, economic shocks, resources that are too plentiful, resources that are too scarce, on and on and on and on. And there's a problem with this, which is that, well, I would say like one of the ways we have, and one of the received wisdoms from trying to look systematically at the conflicts that happen and the conflicts that didn't through regressions like this one, something like 2/3 of conflict papers that are empirical look something like this. They have a measure of violence incidents, a bunch of ones and zeros for years and periods and things that are violent, and zeros for the years or periods that are not. And then they look at some group cleavage or some income shock, and they control for other things. But we have to ask ourselves, and they often find statistically significant coefficients on alpha and beta, but are these actually the causes of war? One of the problems with this sort of literature is that it actually, the number of ones of years of conflict continuation is often 5 or 10 or a larger multiple of the actual number of years when conflict breaks out. So the years when we go from 0 to 1 are vastly outnumbered by the years when we go from 1 to 1, 1 to 1, 1 to 1. And so typically the explanatory power of alpha and beta come from longer and more brutal wars. And when people look at measures of actual new political conflicts breaking out, alpha and beta are closer to 0. That's not as true when we drive down to the micro level, which some of the people on this panel have done. But even when we start to drive down to like a granular grid cell or something else, and we estimate alpha and beta and we see effects on onset, that too is in some sense a measure of conflict continuation and intensity and spread, because it's probably mainly capturing the spread from one part of a region to another, one part of a country, one grid cell to another, one sub-region to another, and so on. And so I find on balance, I think there's been in some sense, it's tragic to me that, and I've contributed to this literature, it's tragic to me that this is something like 2/3 of all empirical conflict papers by one count that we did in about 8 or 10 different top journals. This is an important work to do, but I think we've been essentially looking at too many bullet holes on too many parts of the plane, and we've really been divorced from, I think, what is our core theoretical concept for all bargaining and conflict, which most people here will be familiar with. But it's this basic idea that goes back to Coase, that goes back to Hicks, that goes back to in its application to conflict, the famous treatment by Jim Fearon in 1995, which is to say two sides are dividing a pie, maybe it's a territory, maybe it's a policy space, and they can choose to divide that up peacefully, supposing they're roughly evenly matched. They could choose to sort of split that in half, or they could choose to damage a fraction of that pie or spend money to fight, and then have essentially a 50% chance of winning the whole pie. And so the core message from this sort of rationalist theory of conflict is just to say that actually it's inefficient to fight, that most of the time sides should find a bargain solution because war is costly. And it's these costs of war and the damage to the pie and the efforts to fight that create what's called this bargaining range. All right, and that just creates a range of deals that rivals prefer to war. And so when we think about group cleavages, or when we think about income shocks, like in principle, it shouldn't matter why this pie is large or small. And it shouldn't matter if there are small or moderate, potentially even large shocks. And it also shouldn't necessarily matter if groups are polarized or not, because the basic assumption of this model is that they're separate, they care very little for one another. And they don't take the interests of the other side into account, and they're merely selfish and self-interested. And so shocks and grievances and resources might be relevant, and I want to talk about why before the end, but I don't think they're sufficient to explain wars. And indeed, every time someone has to write a model that actually seriously engages with bargaining, and they want to show that there's a shock or a grievance or group polarization that actually drives war, there's always a hidden trick in that model where there's actually some other thing going on that's interrupting their ability to bargain. So it's not actually the shock per se that's necessarily driving, at least theoretically, but it's actually something else. And so what are those something else's? And what I want to argue, and what I sort of talk about in the book, is that like a full explanation of wars would pay attention to the things that interrupt and make this sort of basic bargaining logic not possible or not optimal for at least one of the two sides. And what I argue is that almost every single explanation that people have come up with across these vast number of literatures and intellectual traditions actually can fit into one of 5 big buckets. And those 5 sort of are separate. Each bucket is sort of large and diverse and full of very, very heterogeneous things, but they all sort of share, each bucket shares like a common logic. There's a reason for every war and a war for every reason, but there are actually only so many kinds of reasons. And I'm not going to be able to sort of have time to sort of walk through each of these today. So I'm going to leave you mostly, hopefully wanting more, and then mostly interested in reading the book. But I do want to just take the last couple of minutes to sort of talk about, breeze past what should be familiar to most economists, the 2 so-called rationalist causes of war, which have absorbed so much of the theoretical literature, even if they're mostly ignored in a lot of the empirical regressions. Most of us are actually familiar with the role that uncertainty, private information, or different priors and disagreements about relative strength can interrupt this bargaining process. We're also sort of familiar with dynamic incentives that can arise from an anticipated power shift and the inability of one side to guarantee the other to commit that they won't sort of exploit them in the future. And so it's this combination of anticipated power shift and a limited ability to compensate or commit to your rival that we call a commitment problem, and can also create a dynamic incentive for war. Most of us are familiar with those. What I actually want to talk about briefly are these other 3 categories, which in some sense, at least 2 of them are rationalist too, but we don't talk about them nearly as much. And one of them, I'll breeze through in the sense of unchecked leaders, is we're all familiar with essentially agency problems, right? The idea that in this bargaining game assumed that whoever's deciding to go to war internalized all those costs and didn't have any private benefits from war that are different from that group. They sort of were unitary actors. And that's, of course, problematic, even in a democracy. And of course, most human societies, for most human history, at any group level, from nations to small gangs, are not democracies. They do have serious principal agent problems. And so unchecked leaders who have their own private interests in war, or who at the very least overlook some of the costs, are going to be more likely to have these bargaining failures. And so this is going to imply that checks and balances and things that solve the agency problem are a primary protection against war, which is a promising, but I would say vastly under-researched claim. You know, two of the exceptions, Ian and Dominic, who are both talking today, I think are sort of rare examples of, I think, really rigorous micro-studies that sort of dive into this and I think provide some compelling evidence. But it's really astonishingly scarce. The last thing I want to really talk about briefly are what I call intangible incentives or misperceptions and passions. And there's a parallel between these two things in the way that behavioral economists and psychologists sort of have classified all of behavioral economics. Matt Rabin has a famous classification where he says most of psychology and economics is just about new assumptions about preferences. So basically introducing non-standard preferences, or what I'm calling intangible incentives. And they're assumptions about how we have persistently erroneous beliefs and how we may actually short circuit our stable utility maximization. And I sort of put type 1 into this intangible incentives bucket, and types 2 and 3, which are blurry, to be quite honest, and I put them into this misperceptions and passions. And in the book, I sort of try to categorize what some of the major subcomponents or things, what are the major intangible incentives or non-standard preferences that will hijack this bargaining logic. It can be justice, desires for justice, it can be desires for glory, status, and esteem, and it can be parochial altruism. These are all things, and particularly a loathing for the out group and an enjoyment and sort of a pleasure in their pain. So essentially, these are direct utility from fighting with the out group. There are also things where, there are also times when you don't necessarily value the act of fighting itself, but violence delivers something only it can deliver. And so violence is what Max Weber called value rational. And this may be times when we want to sort of eliminate the heretical idea, the heretical religion, the heretical ideology, or there may be some compromises that are themselves abhorrent. Economists and political scientists like to talk about indivisibilities, and they like to talk about them as commitment problems, but most of the time these are actually stories about non-standard preferences. There is a bargaining range, but the sides, at least one side, simply refuses that split because that split itself is undesirable. And then within this broad category of misperceptions and passions, I think we really have to center our attention on what are the cases, what are the instances that sort of interrupt strategic bargaining? What are the strategic errors in belief formation that we don't just make briefly, but that we make persistently? And I talk about a lot of the evidence we have from psychology, behavioral economics, and elsewhere about overconfidence, about projection bias, which is where we misunderstand persistently our enemy, and how that's made worse by our tendency to be motivated, especially when dealing with a competitive outgroup. And then I also talk about how all of these things get worse, all of these sort of tendencies gets worse, or so it seems from a lot of the emotion literature, when we're in aroused and highly competitive situations. And so it's not that this non-maximizing behavior, our passions are distinct and cause distinct problems from our misperceptions. Rather, it seems that they magnify our normal dispassionate tendency to have misperceptions and makes them more persistent and more lasting, okay? But I don't have time to walk through all of those and all the evidence in detail because it's just a 20-minute summary of a book. But I do want to talk about what's missing from this is where are these shocks, where are these group identities, where are these grievances? And where I think a lot of this is it's that these 5 forces, an agency problem with a leader, dynamic incentives, uncertainty, intangible incentives like glory or vengeance, our misperceptions and our passions often are not enough to close that bargaining range. But in some sense, the definition of a fragile society, the definition of a fragile state or a fragile gang or a fragile equilibrium between any 2 rivals is one where there's still a bargaining range, but it's a sliver. And that's a situation where any number of idiosyncratic events or flawed leaders, can essentially interrupt that bargaining, at least for a short while and potentially for a long while. And so all of these other bullet holes on the plane, shocks and flawed leaders and so forth, matter. And this is why we see them when we trace back from conflict. And so they clearly do interact because but with these root causes. But I think we really have to center our attention on these more structural factors that narrow the bargaining range and made us vulnerable to these forces, because they're not the fundamental problem. All right. And what we have to do, I think, is focus on most of our programs and policies, if we're serious about stepping back from fragility, have to actually push that bargaining range back. We sort of have to widen the space for two sides to find agreement by reducing uncertainty, providing commitment, checking leaders, reversing these intangible incentives, reducing misperceptions and passions. And in Medellin, that's exactly what happened. There's this unlikely group of peacekeepers. They're called razones. They're sort of a mafia level structure that are above these street level combos. And so even though there's 350 or 400 combos that potentially war on the street, there's only about 15 razones. And what they do is when the billiards war broke out, they did what they've been doing over the last 20 years, steadily pacifying the city. They facilitated information and mediated. They provided commitment to deals between the competing combos. They compelled the gang leaders to internalize the costs of war. And if they if they had an intangible incentive, or if they were misperceiving, or if they had a systematic error, they would correct, and they would, if necessary, punish that, sometimes with the barrel of a gun. And so instead of having 400 sort of potentially warring principalities, you really have about 15 sort of quasi confederations, right? And these razones are extremely effective at keeping the peace. And the reason I like to start with Medellin is because it gets us out of thinking about wars among states and a lot of our sort of usual thinking. We have to recognize that we're all combos in another guise, right? Our cities or our ethnic groups or our countries are just sort of these imperfect sort of confederations of interests with all sorts of propensities for bargaining breakdown. But at the top and at the international level, there's still nonetheless a strong set of incentives to push us towards peace. And there are these imperfect broken actors who are not equal, who are not always very effective, but who are trying to sort of widen that bargaining range and solve these 5 problems. And so, and this is true of our peacekeeping missions, this is true of our UN Security Council, this is true of any of the number of interventions that we have. They're not necessarily as unequal and imperfect and problematic as the razones of Medellin, but that's kind of what a lot of our international and national architectures look like. Nonetheless, even these modest and flawed efforts are working when they work. I think what the second half of the book details is actually when we look at these interventions, the ones that work and the ones that work best work because they're solving one of these 5 problems. And I talk about them as interdependence, checks and balances, organizations of violence control, and interruptions and interventions. And if you're interested in all of those details, I will be delighted to come back in a year and talk about the finished manuscript. And I hope you'll all be interested in the book. Thank you very much.
Much, Chris. That was really interesting. I have a lot of questions. I'm sure others do too. Let me pass the floor to Dominic for his presentation. And just to remind everybody that I'm keeping an eye out on the chat. I think there was some issue with it initially, but it's now open and you should all be able to submit comments and questions through that. Dominic, over to you.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Chris, for the wonderful talk, and thanks a lot to the organizers for setting this fantastic event up. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for being invited. So my talk will be a bit more narrow than Chris's talk, and I'll focus on space in particular, so conflict in space. So how does space matter for conflict? And so let me start with some example here. So you have two countries. Country to the left has 18 little regions and 2 ethnic groups, Group A and Group B, A in yellow and B in blue. And what you see is that they are kind of perfectly separate. So they are kind of it's full ethnic polarization, so it would be an ethnic polarization level of 1. They're just two groups of the same size, and they are, however, occupying completely different places in the country. Country 2 to the right has the same composition of ethnic groups, but they're completely integrated. They're all living nearby others. And so if we are in a world where distance matters, where you can strike more easily somebody who's close by, as we've seen, for example, in the Northern Ireland conflict, then you would expect much more violence in this second country than in the first one, right? And so if you run the kind of regression that Chris has pointed out as a bad example before, if you run this kind of regression where you would look at ethnic diversity as a driver of conflict, and the index of ethnic diversity that you take is ethnic polarization, and you run a regression at the country year level, well, what will happen is that it will suffer from some omitted variable bias, because this variable of ethnic diversity will fail to capture the spatial dimension of the whole thing. So I completely agree with what Chris was saying as a conclusion there. So that's kind of to illustrate that, well, it's kind of can be very dangerous to abstract from space. Now let me give a second example. As Chris was saying, well, cell level studies may already be an improvement if we focus on little cells of 50 times 50 kilometers rather than at the country year level. However, even at the cell level, we are not immune to kind of important problems linked to underestimating space. So here you have twice the same country, if you like, but you have conflict here, which is the symbol for conflict is a big A in red here. So in group A, there is conflict here in the left example, very close to where people from group B are. So, and the conflict is actually driven by the interaction of A and B. It's not characteristics of group A per se, but it's the interaction between A and B that drives conflict. While in the other example, there is conflict that is taking place in areas of group A, but they're not necessarily, they're kind of random, they're not related to B. And so if you run a cell level regression, you may end up with exactly the same conclusion for the two settings that are completely different, because you may fail to take into account this interaction that between A and B that are the source in the left example of conflict, while in the right example, it would be indeed characteristics of A. So to put differently, if you, the origin and the target of conflict may be different. So it may be that the reason of conflict is another cell, is this cell level B here, rather than the place where conflict takes place. And so if we run cell level regressions without taking into account spatial interactions, we may get very wrong conclusions and focusing only on the characteristics of a given cell. So how can we tackle these problems? Well, I'll talk about three different things. First, about distance, the importance of distance, where basically talking about recent research where if you focus on ethnic group sizes rather than location, what you get wrong, as in the first example, is you don't take into account that there is some decay of distance, that it's cheaper to attack places that are nearby than far away. And this is kind of, this would lead to very wrong estimations of risks of conflict, for example. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. The second dimension of space that is important to take into account is to separate sources from targets. So a place where conflict originates may not be the same place than where you see it. And if you focus kind of naively only on where you see conflict pop up, you may kind of get the root causes wrong. Again, some point that I share with Chris last talk. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is networks. So networks, spatial networks are really important drivers of fighting behavior. So the first paper I'm going to talk about is one that just came out. It's forthcoming in Economic Journal. It's joint work with Hannes Müller and David Schönholzer. And what we do is we've set up some model of strategic spatial interaction between groups, and we estimate it structurally using data from 24 ethnically divided countries. And so the paper is called Ethnic Violence Across Space. And so to kind of illustrate as a motivation for what we're doing, let's have a look at this map of Iraq, where you have in blue the Shia territories, you have in brown you have Kurdish territories, and you have the Sunni territories in orange. And what you see is that conflict really, and conflict is in red, and bigger circles mean more conflict. And what you see is that conflict really takes place in kind of tectonic areas, a bit like volcanoes where the different zones meet. And these kind of tectonic plates that meet are really very strong predictors of the actual location of conflict. So conflict takes place if one group is very close to a rival group, and these are kind of the hot spots where conflict erupts. And when you look at Northern Ireland, we also zoomed in on Northern Ireland in this research at some point. It's very striking there. Really, the map of Belfast would, if you can really predict exactly where conflict would erupt. And that's kind of a key thing that's often neglected, and that for predictions of conflict and also for peacekeeping efforts, where do you want to do the public policy programs for reducing the incentives for conflict? Well, these may be kind of the areas you may want to target most. So if we run just like some reduced form bin scatter regression, we see this picture. So here we have on the horizontal axis the distance to the nearest ethnic boundary in kilometers, and on the vertical axis we have the number of casualties. And you see this negative correlation where basically if you're very close, on average you have many more fatalities. Now, this is just a reduced form to motivate what we do. What we then do is that the main contribution is this structural estimation of our model. And when we do that, we can calculate for each country some spatial decay of conflict functions. So if you take, for example, something like 250 kilometers here, for 250 kilometers here, for the median country, the spatial weight that you give to a place in your incentives to attack, kind of the attacks, if you like, drops by 50%. So you're 50%, you're half as keen to attack somebody who's 250 kilometers away than you are to somebody who's really nearby. And so you have this spatial decay, and after 500 kilometers for almost all countries, even if you have some rival group 500 kilometers away, well, it's too far away for an attack, and conflict drops dramatically. And so that's kind of taking into account this spatial decay of conflict can kind of completely change the predictions of where you would expect attacks, and that's kind of important to take into account. And so these predicted attacks here on the horizontal axis, they actually correlate very highly with the actual total casualty. So the out of sample prediction, if you like, of our model lines up very well with reality. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. Now let me talk about a second aspect that's also crucial. One is to separate the source from the target. So where conflict starts, so maybe conflict would start in Washington, but it may end up exploding in Boston. And so it's important to know where it starts and what's the origin, what's the target. So in this paper I've just mentioned before, we do some analysis where we kind of calculate where the origin and the target is of the violence. But for doing that, you don't need necessarily a complicated structural model. You can also do it with reduced form. And in the presentations of Nathan and Matthias later on in this conference today, you will see that. You will see that you have some negative weather shock in some place, and then people move, and then conflict takes place somewhere else potentially. And so basically this illustrates perfectly this importance to take into account the difference between the source and the target. And here I'm going to talk about some other recent paper on which I've been working with Nicolas Berman, Mathieu Coutenier, and Matthias Tönig, that we published in 2017, This Mine is Mine, where we also found something kind of related to that. Where basically, I'll be a bit quick, I'll not explain all the details of this table, but basically we have conflict on the left-hand side, and we explain conflict with price shocks of the main minerals in the ethnic homelands of a given area, of a given ethnic group. So which means that the idea is that even if you are, if you're a group from Texas and you're fighting in Washington, but actually your funding comes from Texas oil, then if oil prices in Texas go up, you have more funding available and you will fight harder in Washington where you fight. And that's kind of what we find with mining here in our sample for Africa, is that the ethnic group homelands, if there is some resource boom by high mineral prices in the homelands of a given ethnic group, then a fighting group that is connected to this ethnic group would fight harder, even outside these homelands. And that's kind of can explain much in terms of financing of rebellion. So then there's another paper I wanted to mention that's also I think something really cool, really interesting about separating source and target. So there is this literature that I quote here. There is some literature on the dynamics of conflict, but the paper I'm going to focus on is this one by Natalia Nofta in GIA, 2016. And so what she does is she has built a model where basically ethnic groups decide to attack or not, depending on three variables: the ethnic population share, the ethnic group's weapon ratio, and the success of co-ethnics in other battles. So the first two, in a given area, whether your ethnic group is a majority group and whether you're militarily stronger, well, these are kind of static things here, but the searching is dynamic. So if your co-ethnics win in other places in the country, then there's kind of a domino effect, and spillovers take place, and you start have higher incentives to fight yourself. And she takes this model to the data with municipal level data on attacks in the Bosnian civil war. And so to have just one slide with the predictions of her model, the space of attacks is here in gray, where basically, and you attack, you have higher incentives to attack where you have a bigger population share of your group. Serbs have more incentives to attack if the region is majoritarian Serbian, and if they have a weapons advantage. And this zone, this gray zone of attacks, becomes bigger in the situation where your co-ethnics have been doing well on other battlefields in other areas of the conflict. And that would kind of increase this zone of where a group attacks, according to her model. When she takes that to the data for the Bosnian conflict, she finds exactly that. So the probability of winning, the Serb share, and the neighbor success would be three variables that would be strong predictors of attacks in a given municipality. And I mean, this was like a horrible conflict, and kind of being able to make predictions of what could happen and which places may be the next ones to start fighting is kind of crucial, especially maybe for international actors like the World Bank. So I think this is really kind of a very relevant research, actually, what she's doing. So let me now shift to the last part of my talk, where I want to talk about networks. Networks are also a key factor in conflict. And I'll first talk about a paper that I have together with Michael Koenig, Matthias Koenig and Fabrizio Silibotti, Networks in Conflict, paper from 2017. What we do in this paper, we start from a contest success function, the kind of, the standard contest success function, like a Tulop contest success function, where my winning chances are my effort divided by the total effort. And well, we take this kind of standard contest success function, but we generalize it, taking into account a network setting, where basically my allies' fighting effort help me and my enemies' fighting effort harm me. And then we do a structural estimation of this model on data from the Second Congo War, one of the deadliest conflicts in Africa in the last few decades. Here you see the network for Congo. For the Second Congo War, this was an internationalized civil war with plenty of actors, Rwanda, Uganda, plenty of Zimbabwe, other countries involved, plenty of rebel groups, and kind of a messy network, as you see here. And so then we estimate this. Here I'm not going to go through the details in the interest of time, but let me just say that what we find is kind of for the enemies, as predicted by the models, we find a contest effect. So if my enemies fight harder, I will also fight harder to confront them. However, if my allies fight harder, then I free ride on their efforts. And that's kind of a free riding effect of where my allies fight harder, I will fight less. And so we take these coefficient estimates of how I react to my enemy fighting and how I react to my allied fighting. We take these coefficient estimates and then we can do plenty of simulations of counterfactuals. And that's what we do here. We look at weapons embargo, at bilateral pacification, at plenty of things. But here I'll just show you one graph, one table on kind of a key player analysis of removing individual armed groups, where you would kind of find a way to get rid of one group from this conflict, for example, by offering them some kind of way to some work program to make them lay down the arms. So here you could, for all the key players, you would know, well, what is kind of their impact on the conflict and the rent dissipation, and you see that for some of them, they're kind of responsible for a big part of this conflict. So you know kind of who you would have to target in terms of pacification efforts of getting them off the conflict. Then there is a recent paper that I also wanted to mention by Amar Rashinge et al. And what they do is they build also a network model of conflict, and they not just apply to one country, but they look at 53 African countries over the period from 1989 to 2015, and they look at natural disasters as exogenous shocks. And what they find is that natural disasters divert fighting activity to surrounding localities. So if you have a natural disaster hitting, again, Washington, then maybe fighters will move from Washington to Boston and more fighting will take place in Boston. And the way these natural disaster shocks diffuses in the network is linked to exactly network parameters like geographic and road networks. So again, this has the merit for policymakers to kind of be helpful for predictions of where conflict may take place in order to kind of plan in advance pacification efforts. So let me conclude. So space matters. It's crucial to take into account distance, the interdependence between locations, as well as networks. And it's particularly crucial for some of the biggest challenges that we face in our generation today, related to climate change. So Nathan and Matthias will talk more about that, where basically, again, climate change is exactly something where space matters, where the origin of a conflict and the target of conflict breaking out is not necessarily the same, and also about migration, where again linked to climate migration or also other migration in general, where again space matters a lot, and that's why I think it would be crucial to study this in more depth in the coming years. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Very much, Dominic. There's lots happening on the chat, so I'm gonna try to start sort of grouping some questions and get the discussion going. So I'll start with a couple of questions for Chris, then Dominic, I'll come to you, and then I think there are a few questions that really would apply to both, and it would be nice to get both your perspectives. So Chris, maybe to start with you, there were a series of questions in the chat around these factors that you identify as drivers of conflict, you know, uncertainty, commitment problems, etc. So I'm gonna sort of throw a few of those at you, and then so people were asking the extent to which we are able to sort of map, you know, different conflicts over the last few decades to each one of these factors or to a combination of those. You know, what's the relative importance? I guess that's part of the question. And then has that changed over time? You know, have we seen a change in the nature of drivers? And then also related to that, you did say that war and conflict are the exception rather than the rule. And yet I think there's a sense that things are getting worse in recent years. We hear people talking about an increasing fragility and increasing conflict in Africa, in the Middle East, you know, and elsewhere. So I wanted to ask you, you know, whether your sense is that that's true, and if so, what's driving that? And you know, can we think about it in terms of these factors that you were talking about? So I know that's a lot of different questions, but I think they all sort of related to, you know, how we understand conflict and try to bring some order to our thinking. So over to you, and then I'll come to Dominic.
Okay, so explain all wars and world peace. 5 minutes, I can do it. So I would say those are two fabulous questions, and thank you for synthesizing that in that way. I think that's a fabulous way to put it. I think that so in many wars, I think many of these factors are operating at once, and the book walks through many examples. I think from the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece to gang wars in Medellin or Chicago to the US invasion of Iraq, interreligious violence in India, and so on and so on and so on, partly because I want to illustrate the versatility of these ideas. And most of these stories and ideas are not mine. I'm trying to synthesize what I think a vast literature has given us. Some of it's micro-empirical, some of it's very political historical. And, you know, I think each of these wars has to sort of be weighed in context, and there's often debates. You take something like the US invasion of Iraq, and I'd say there's an enormous amount of disagreement, but most of the stories that people talk about, the reasons for the US invasion of Iraq, fit in these 5 buckets. I think the popular conceptions of what are essentially stories of unchecked leaders, which is Bush and Cheney being, you know, Texan oil barons and invading for selfish interests, I think is a kind of unchecked leaders argument. I don't think it's actually one with a lot of empirical weight, but we don't need to ignore it. I think most people who study this think that's not particularly significant. Likewise, they dismiss a lot of the intangible incentives. But there's a lot of strong arguments for a role for misperceptions, especially overconfidence, not in the cost of fighting. Everybody knew who would win that invasion, but the cost of regime change, which is a larger and longer and obviously failed project. But I think a lot of the people who study, even some of the rationalist skeptics, agree that there's a huge role for uncertainty and commitment problems. And a lot of the best analysts have really settled on the risk of Saddam Hussein developing a nuclear weapon as provoking a commitment problem, but perhaps not one that was completely decisive. And hence you have there's room for leader errors, and there's room for misperceptions like overconfidence, and there's room for any uncheckedness like being an oil baron to sort of, I think, tip towards something like the invasion. So that's a good example. And so I think the purpose of the book is to sort of, I think, educate people enough in these things to get them thinking, so that when we think about a war and when someone says, oh, the reason, and then they come up with some random reason that this, you'll read a history book and the World War I broke out because of fill in the blank, and you will find many blanks. For you to at least be able to categorize these explanations and think about them. If I had to say what I think is the most persistent, the most prevalent cause, is this idea of unchecked leaders, is this idea of an agency problem. Because most human societies for most of history have not been checked. Small elite ruling cabals have made the decision whether or not to go to war, and they've ignored vast amounts of costs. And that's even true today in less so in advanced democracies, which I think helps explain the democratic piece, but it's still imperfect. And so I think we've really underexplored this as a profession. And I think we really need to think about, not about democratization elections, which may be part of that, but not necessarily. I think we really need to think about what I've emphasized in the book, which is what people like Eleanor Ostrom or Amos Sawyer or others have called polycentricity, or what James Madison called checks and balances. And I think we really need to think about checking and balancing power more seriously. So that's part one. And then part two, about is violence getting worse, and I think it's absolutely the case, and many people have shown this, and the most popular account is Steven Pinker, that within states violence is going down. Interpersonal violence has been declining. It's not monotonic everywhere, it goes up and down, but for the most part we've entered an era of more and more violence controlling institutions that sometimes we call states, sometimes we call them prisiones. And at the international level, we have human rights law and the International Criminal Court and the UN Security Council, all of which operate imperfectly, but I think have steadily pushed a lot of small group and interpersonal and repressive violence down. Then there's a larger and longer debate about whether or not war violence has become less or not. I think it's what's surely true is that wars are less frequent, but when they break out, because our weapons are more powerful, they're doozies. They're really bad, and so the sum effect of that makes for a more ambiguous story on whether or not war has actually declined. My sense is it probably is, but we'll need decades more to tell. But my sense is that I think this movement towards stronger states, towards stronger international institutions, and I just don't mean the Security Council, I mean bodies of international law and so forth, are pushing this in a promising direction. But this is a generations-long project, so I'm quite optimistic. But it's slower, and in the UN system, so deeply broken, like so embarrassingly, shockingly broken. And that's something most people don't know or talk about outside of these, inner circles. But that's the tragedy. It's the brokenness of our UN mission. Everything from the lowest level of the United Nations up to the top level, just the sheer absolute brokenness. And that makes me, and I don't see a path to reform. So I think my optimism is also limited.
Dominic, there were a few questions about this idea of the distance decay parameter, right? How do we think about that? What are sort of some of the practical implications? So let me ask you some of those questions, just building from what people were asking. So there was a question on, does this distance decay parameter depend on things like, the size of a country, or the size of the ethnic groups that, may be prone to conflict, the distribution of economic activity, other factors. So are there sort of correlates out there that we can point to as we try to understand this better? And related to that, do you see major differences in sort of the value or the role of these parameters across countries or regions? I mean, say Africa versus others. And similar to what we just asked Chris, is this changing over time? Is the value or the impact of these parameters, to the extent that you have that kind of data? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, no. So I guess there are two forces here, kind of generally speaking. So one is kind of this force that basically being closer by makes it easier to attack somebody, and you see this like in Northern Ireland, for example. You see this very clearly where people started from their home ward, from their home place. They did some kind of quick attack to some neighboring ward with the majority of the other religion, and then they went back to their home base where they were kind of secure. And that's kind of the thing that drove this. I mean, as you've seen in the graph, when I looked at different countries, so there are all the details in the paper, a long appendix where you see for every country exactly what's going on. The paper is on our websites if you want to have a look at it. So you see there is quite some heterogeneity actually. And we look at the paper. In the paper we look at a variety of correlates. So again, we have some analysis, but I'm not going to go into detail here. But please check it out. So there is quite some heterogeneity. I guess in terms of changing over time, I think that there are two forces. One is the force of kind of being closer, you can attack more easily, but the other one is kind of the positive contact hypothesis. And in other work that we've done in the past, we have a paper called War Signals from Review of Economic Studies 2013, together with Matthias Tönig and Fabrizio Silibotti. There we have this interaction, actually, this interdependence that's also kind of a key factor. And Chris, I know he also talks about interdependence quite a bit in his book. And so it's kind of on the one hand, being close together gives you the potential to do joint business, ethnic diversity, and kind of know each other well. And on the other hand, it of course makes it also easier to attack each other. So which of the two forces will win? Well, as we kind of have shown in another paper, I have like a recent PNAS paper on that, where basically it depends on democracy. And so if you have a democracy where you have kind of power sharing between groups, and groups are no group is kind of crushed by some other groups, you have kind of minorities that are respected, then being close together and very integrated, kind of the patchwork that we saw in the first slide with the blue and the yellow very close, can actually be good news. And you have more trade, you have bigger opportunity costs from conflict breaking out, and you can kind of create the New York style melting pot society. However, if the two groups are not politically kind of in a relationship of democracy, and one group gets kind of crushed by the other, then kind of proximity is kind of dangerous. So it's a double-edged knife, if you like. Short question, long answer. Sorry for that.
Thank you. No, I know none of these questions really has a right answer, right? But I think it's good to hear how the two of you would think through that. I'm gonna do one more round with the two of you, and then maybe come to a couple of the common questions. So Chris, reacting to your comment on unchecked leaders, and picking up on something that was said earlier, there's this reflection that they may be the triggers of conflict, but they still need to mobilize sort of other initially maybe passive actors to kind of like play out that conflict for them, right? So what do we know about how leaders do these? And in one of the comments, people were pointing out things like forced conscription, or the threat of jail. But what do we know about that? And more broadly, if we think about, and maybe this is a little bit of a false dichotomy, but if we think about sort of the emergence of conflict and the propagation of conflict, right, and the fact that those may respond to different mechanisms, are we more able to prevent one or the other? How should we be thinking about those two separately or interacting? And Dominic, this also relates a little bit to what you were saying earlier about where conflict happens in space. So I'll come to you after for some reactions on this as well. Chris, let me start with you.
Sure. Okay, so I have to tell a little story because it's one of my favorite stories, which is it's 1933 and Nazi brown shirts are ransacking, Berlin, And Albert Einstein is sitting in his little cottage outside of Berlin, and it's not just the Nazi brown shirts, like ever since the First World War, he's just completely consumed by understanding war and violence. And he decides to start a set of public letters where he wants to sort of understand. He's asking this exact question. And he has this question. He writes this letter that says, we know that the problem is these unchecked leaders. He uses different language, but he basically says, we know it's these unaccountable leaders. You can see them all over Europe. And so we know why, and we know their sort of venal interests and why they're going to war. The puzzle is, why would anybody follow them? Like, how did they get the masses? And so this is essentially a psychological question. And so he's writing the letter, this open letter, to the foremost psychologist of the day, who's Sigmund Freud. And Freud was completely consumed and transformed by the First World War. Prior to that, he just focused on the erotic. And then he sort of watched as Europe went into chaos, and like a lot of intellectuals, he asked why. And he decided to then devote himself to understanding human aggression. And so that's when he comes up with his idea of the death instinct, and the fact that we all have an innate drive for destruction. And so his answer to Einstein is to say, oh, of course you're right. They're both very astute political scientists. And so it's amazing how much we've forgotten and ignored unchecked leaders. But he says, of course, you're absolutely right. Like, the fundamental problem with World War I, with everything that's happening today, are these unchecked elites. And then he tries to come up with an answer, his first answer, which is that this innate drive for war. I think the evidence since that we've come a long way. They were very astute political scientists. I don't think they were very good psychologists when it comes to war. And I think the short answer is that a lot of the research in the 100 years almost since that has rejected this idea of an innate violence or an innate preference for aggression. It's just not true. That said, we do seem to have an ability under certain circumstances to be this is sort of what I call parochial altruism and Schadenfreude. Apologies to the Germans in the audience for my pronunciation. The idea that we can actually be mobilized to loathe the other side. I think, but even then, the evidence isn't particularly strong. It's not always successful. I think there is some sense that we can be mobilized to want relative status vis-a-vis a competitive group, which is what I call glory. And I think we can mobilize to sort of around injustices and grievances and want vengeance. And so what all of these things are sort of intrinsic direct utilities from violence. And so then the question is, how are these mobilized and manipulated by elites? And I think we have a lot of research, whether it's work on Indian elites and institutionalized riot machines, all the way up to Rwandan genocidaires and Nazi radio and all these things that skillful political leaders are constantly trying to inflame the passions of the masses. A lot of them fail, right? Just think about all of the failed politicians. Like, politicians are sort of like, they're up there like comedians trying to sort of figure what's funny, except they're trying to figure out what gets people to do stuff despite their best interests sometimes. And so I think there are technologies like radio, and there are skillful politicians, and there are moments where this works. A lot of the time it doesn't. And I think we have some glimpses into what's going on, but we don't really understand what we don't know. And because we focus too much on the wars that do happen, is we focus on the times when these wars when these elites do mobilize these masses. We don't really understand, we don't pay attention to all the times when they failed. And I think that's where the research needs to go. We need to sort of not select on the dependent variable and really understand that, but I don't think we have that complete answer yet.
Thank you. Dominic, I don't know if you want to add anything on this issue of sort of emergence and propagation and how, over to you.
No, so I think it's like a key question, right? What makes wars feasible in terms of recruiting followers? And I guess, my answer would be kind of complementary to Chris's answer. Like kind of a cold-hearted economist, I would kind of focus on opportunity costs. So if you have a nice, well-paid jobs, as we kind of all have within a cozy office and stuff, it's hard to make us resign from university and run around with a Kalashnikov, right? However, if you're miserable, you cannot find food for your family, you're in a desperate situation of need, it's much easier to recruit you. And so kind of having low wages is kind of a key factor, I guess. And And so there is this research program. So we have this CPR, Research and Policy Network on Preventing Conflict. Chris is part of it and several other people here as well. And with this group, we kind of, several of us have focused on studying things that are like related to public policies. So I have, for example, a paper on education, how education can kind of prevent conflict through these channels. Together with Elena, who's also here in the audience, we have something on health policies, and together with other authors. Chris has done very nice work also on labor program for kind of dangerous young men. So it's always the men who are dangerous on average. So kind of, you know, like, so these kind of broad set of public policies that kind of can make war more costly because you have more to lose if you have a higher productivity and better wages. With Matthias, we have some annual review paper on that as well. But I stopped advertising all these papers now. But kind of the, you know, the main punchline, I guess, from my perspective, is this kind of finding a way to have to increase productivity, increasing wages, and hence make war more costly. And I think it's nicely complementary to the Chris point on psychology. They're kind of two things, and they mutually reinforce each other. So it's not either one or the other. It's kind of, you have to tackle both of them at the same time.
Thank you, and you know, fully agree on that. All right, I have a couple questions for both of you, and you know, with that, we'll try to wrap up and also sort of start to bring the conversation maybe a bit closer to some of the issues that will be dealt with later. So the first question is, you know, what's the role of borders, right? I mean, in a way, in this workshop, we are thinking about, you know, cross-country sort of regional conflict as mediators of both space, right? So do borders sort of somehow create distance, or is this just sort of a fictional kind of notion, right? When we, and that's more sort of, or as mediators, create of some of the causes of conflict that you talked about, right? I mean, do borders play a role explicitly? And if they do, you know, what does that mean that we should think differently about sort of national conflicts versus sort of, you know, that then spill over versus cross-national conflicts? Or are these all sort of artificial differentiations that somehow we've constructed, but ultimately, you know, these things aren't really that different? So that's kind of the first question, you know, how, if we bring borders into the picture, right? And how does that matter or not for what you both are saying? And then I'm going to ask you the inevitable question, which is not an easy question, but, you know, we have a large number of colleagues that work on these issues at the World Bank, either directly on our fragility and conflict work or working on other issues in fragile and conflict environments. And you know, I wonder if you have any sort of reflections on, you know, what your work or, you know, the findings that you've described mean practically for some of the more operational work that we do, right? I mean, what should be some of the things that we take away as an institution that engages with governments across a variety of sectors in these kinds of contexts? So let me start with you, Dominic, this time, and then I'll go to Chris afterwards.
Hey, thanks a lot. Yeah, I guess, I mean, for borders, I think there are two elements. One is like the aspect of porous borders, where kind of rebels can hide on one side, you know, Lord's resistance army from Uganda can hide in southern Sudan, etc. And Luis Martinez from Harris School has kind of great work on that. And the other thing is kind of the other is kind of the original sin of imperialists from Europe, kind of creating all kinds of trouble in Africa, from which we still, the world is suffering, and Africa in particular is suffering today. Mikalopoulos and Papayannou, they have some great paper on that as well. So I think one is kind of that borders, if they're in states with weak state capacity, if the borders are not super well controlled, then the rebels can play cat and mouse on both sides of the borders. And the other thing is kind of the artificial border problematic, as I was saying. In terms of the World Bank, so I think, I mean, yeah, I mean, the World Bank, I think, is doing great work in general, right? In terms of doing great research and very useful things. So I think the kind of thing I would want to to maybe see more would be like things like the big kind of public policies and see what is the effect of public policies on pacifying regions. So with Patrick Prémont from the World Bank, we've been talking a lot about that, but also with Deon Filmer and Bénédicte de la Brière, we've been talking about education, and so I think that you have several groups in the World Bank who are kind of who are fantastically well placed to do more research on that. So I think the thing I would push if I was you would be something like doing more randomized control trial where you evaluate the political security aspects of several of these programs, where food programs or you have education programs, health policy programs, redistribution, etc. And I think labor market programs. So I think these would be kind of things that where I have hope that could be kind of something that makes a difference. But I think so far we have very few points of data. Another thing that was kind of promising was the work of André Ladoube on reconciliation programs in Sierra Leone. Again, RCT, that's something I find very kind of convincing, and that could be another thing where basically the World Bank as a great intellectual leader could play a role to boost these kind of RCTs and policy evaluations.
Thank you, Dominic. Chris, over to you.
I guess what I would say is what I sort of want to sort of encourage people to do is, this is a great example where someone will say, well, what about X and conflict, or what about Y and here X is borders, and I think we want to look at it through this theoretical lens, right? And it's not my theoretical lens, right? I'm just trying to distill and organize what I think others have given us. And so and then I think you realize that borders play a role, but it's a different set of stories, and there's a distinct set of ways. So if I had to say, so first of all, like, remember our pie and the bargaining ranges, those splits are those are borders, right? To the extent that we're talking about territory. And so borders they're just a split between rival nations. What's interesting though, as soon as you make borders inflexible and you create, it's basically impossible to change them. Now you've limited the degrees of freedom for a bargain, at least on that one dimension, which means that all the other issues between two rivals have to are in play, right? And probably that's going to narrow the bargaining range somewhat. Now there might be other good reasons to do that, but nonetheless we have to recognize that this is the role that, like, Westphalian state systems and blah 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 plays. Likewise, I think there's another dimension, but it's not so that's kind of about bargaining frictions and in creating indivisibilities in some ways. The other way, just as an example, is like when we have an international system that invests all power in the sovereign, and even if that person is sitting in like Kinshasa and controls this state, right? This is inherently problematic in some ways. One, these are often invests more power in these highly centralized rulers. So this international system we have is accentuating problems of unchecked leaders very often. The fact that the World Bank or the UN cannot treat with a regional governor or a city is accentuating this problem, right? The whole international aid infrastructure is accentuating problems of unchecked leaders. And then they try to make up for it with like community-driven development programs and try to balance out the ledger, right? But that's this imperfect solution. You combine that with the fact that that I think that system also creates an enormous number of commitment problems, and I could go through a long list of commitment problems that this creates. And so the borders are kind of incidental to that. It's this fixedness. The problem is the way in which the rest other players in the game internationally invest so much power in the sovereign and sort of exaggerate and distend this already elite-driven system. So I just sort of, whenever that X comes up, I just sort of encourage people as the thought experiment, how do we think of it through this lens? Because then the solutions, I think, make more sense, right? And we can start to think about, and that's kind of my answer to your second question in a really generic way. I mean, I think the one thing we have to do is we have to think about all of our solutions in terms of how are they solving these problems, because we have a lot of interventions that actually are not solving these problems at all, or not solving these problems in a cost-efficient way. And just like, if I give one example, like think if you're the mayor of Chicago, right? So this is Chicago, obviously. And you think of all the things a sensible sounding mayor would say about targeting violence. So we need to reduce poverty, we need to provide employment, we need maybe decarceration, all sorts of like reform the police, so on and on and on and on, right? None of these things are clearly addressing fundamental issues that are actually driving violence in a place like Chicago. On the other hand, if you say, actually what's happening is most of the murders are committed by, there's 300 relatively disorganized armed organizations that are competing for territory. And the reason there's no razones to sort of control this mess and actually keep them from being violent is because we arrested them all 20 years ago. And anytime a criminal leader sticks up their head, we chop it off. So we've got a bunch of young men engaged in retaliatory violence here. Most of them are under 20. And so what we need is a solution that actually sort of finds alternative ways for young men to resolve conflict or save face and essentially compete for this territory, not need to compete at all. All right. And actually we've taken something that's, I think, been very successful in West Africa and elsewhere, which is a model of cognitive behavior therapy and employment. And we've been running it in Chicago at scale for the last few years. We've been running it as a trial. We're seeing a 40% drop in homicide arrests in our treatment group, right? But what are we doing? We're not trying to give everybody jobs. We're trying to find the 3,000 people who are going to shoot this year, give them a job, give them the skills they need to resolve conflicts differently. And that's a very different approach that says we need to identify the specific failures that are happening in this specific context, which is really, really hard. And we need to try a bunch of things until we figure out what works, right? And we'll sort of learn by self-discovery. We'll tinker our way to a solution, but only if we're like focused on diagnosing the problem correctly.
Thank you so much to both of you. We are at the hour, and I obviously will not attempt to summarize the discussion, which I think was very rich, and I know will spill over into the next session. But just to share at a personal level, maybe a couple of takeaways, as I was hearing you speak, particularly in this very last round of questions. And I think it's this idea of, there's the economic drivers of conflict, and then the sort of more psychological, social, behavioral. And I think, Chris, you touched upon an important point that is, institutions like ours, but I think just more generally, many of us in the economics profession have tend to emphasize one of those and not the other, and bringing them together and really thinking about those dynamics and what they mean for policy is important. So I take that away as somebody who, works on some of these issues. But thanks again. There was lots in the chat that we didn't get to the extent that you can scan that and maybe have some views on that. I'm sure participants would appreciate it. Some of them were very specific, but some of them were I think, interesting and general questions. But thanks again to both of you, and looking forward to the rest of the event. And I guess, Remy, I just pass the floor to you for the next session.